The moment arrogance asks to see the truth is usually the moment it begins to collapse. In the winter of 1944, a train carrying an unusual group of prisoners rolled quietly through the gray English countryside. The war was still raging across Europe, but here, miles away from the front lines, the air felt strangely calm. Inside one of the guarded railcars sat several women who did not behave like ordinary prisoners of war. Their backs were straight, their coats were buttoned with precision, and their eyes moved carefully, observing everything. These women had once held powerful positions inside Germany's vast wartime industry. They were planners, administrators, and strategic minds who had helped manage factories, supply networks, and production chains that stretched across the continent. In their former offices, men twice their size had waited outside their doors for instructions. Now they sat behind a locked carriage door under British guard. Yet even as prisoners, they carried themselves with the same quiet certainty. At the center of the group sat Anna Weiss. She was not the oldest among them, but she had the calmest presence. Her posture never slouched. Her voice rarely rose. When she spoke, the others listened. A week earlier, inside a modest administrative building at the prisoner camp in northern England, Anna had made a request that surprised everyone in the room. Across the wooden desk sat Captain Edward Collins, the British officer responsible for overseeing the facility. Collins had spent years in logistics before the war, and he had learned to read people carefully. When Anna Weiss calmly folded her hands and asked to visit British war factories, he did not answer immediately. For several seconds the room remained silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. The other German officers waited with faint smiles, as if the answer did not truly matter. To them, this request was more curiosity than necessity. They had spent years inside Germany's massive industrial system. They believed they already understood how the modern war machine worked. Collins studied them quietly. Outside the window, cold wind moved through the bare trees of the camp yard. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and asked a single question. Why? Anna answered without hesitation. Because we want to see how strong Britain really is. The tone was polite, but beneath it was something else. Confidence. Perhaps even quiet doubt about the stories they had been hearing since their capture. Collins noticed the glances exchanged among the women. He had seen that expression before in officers who believed they already knew the answer to a question. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded once and stood. Very well, he said. You'll see it. None of the women realized it then, but that decision would become a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Because within 48 hours, they would step inside a place that would change the way they understood the war itself. And before that train returned to the camp, one of them would quietly whisper a sentence no German strategist had ever expected to say. The following morning the camp woke before sunrise. Frost clung to the wooden fence posts, and a pale gray light stretched slowly across the yard. Guards moved quietly along the gravel paths while a transport truck waited near the main gate. Inside the administrative building, Captain Edward Collins stood beside a narrow window, holding a tin cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. He had spent most of the night reviewing paperwork that rarely left the military archives. Production statistics, factory schedules, transportation routes measured not in miles but in minutes. Britain was fighting a war that depended on timing as much as strength. When Collins finally stepped outside, the group of German prisoners was already waiting under guard. They wore the same calm expressions they had carried since arriving at the camp. Their coats were buttoned carefully against the cold wind. Anna Weiss stood at the front of the small line. She appeared composed, almost curious. Her eyes moved across the camp yard, studying the watchtowers, the gates, the distant road beyond the fence. Collins approached slowly. For a moment neither side spoke. The guards opened the gate, and the women were guided toward the waiting truck that would take them to the rail station several miles away. As the engine started and the truck rolled onto the narrow country road, the camp faded behind them. The English countryside in winter looked quiet and almost peaceful. Low stone walls divided the farmland into long rectangular fields. Bare trees leaned toward the road while thin morning fog hovered over the ground. The prisoners sat on wooden benches inside the covered truck. At first the conversation among them was soft but confident. One woman mentioned the vast steel plants she had once supervised near the Rhine. Another spoke about locomotive production numbers that had once seemed impossible for any other nation to match. Their voices carried a tone of professional pride rather than anger. They believed they understood industry better than most soldiers ever could. Anna listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was usually to ask small practical questions. How far was the train station? How long the journey might be? Captain Collins sat across from them, steady and quiet. Occasionally his eyes drifted to the road ahead where the fog was beginning to lift. Within 30 minutes the truck reached the small station where a dark military train waited beside the platform. Steam rose slowly from the engine, and the metal wheels creaked as the cars shifted slightly on the track. A few railway workers moved along the platform checking equipment. Everything was efficient and unhurried. Collins stepped down first and signaled for the prisoners to follow. As Anna Weiss placed her foot on the platform, she paused for a moment and looked at the long line of freight cars attached behind the passenger carriage. Most of them were sealed. Their surfaces carried small chalk markings and shipment codes. She recognized the system immediately. Supply transport. Large scale. Regular schedules. Her eyes narrowed slightly with professional interest. The train whistle sounded once, and the doors were secured. Minutes later the locomotive began to move, slowly pulling the train north through the cold English morning. Inside the carriage the German officers still carried their quiet confidence. None of them realized that before the day ended they would see something that would begin to dismantle that certainty piece by piece. The train gathered speed as it moved deeper into the English countryside, the steady rhythm of steel wheels against the tracks filling the quiet carriage. Inside, the atmosphere remained composed but observant. Anna Weiss sat beside the window, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap while the gray landscape passed by outside. Fields rolled past in long frozen stretches, broken by narrow roads and small villages that appeared and disappeared in the distance. At first the view seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, but Anna noticed details others might miss. Freight trains moving on parallel lines. Long rows of coal cars waiting near switching yards. Occasional convoys of military trucks traveling along country roads that crossed beneath the tracks. Each detail suggested movement, coordination, and scale. Across from her, one of the German officers leaned forward and spoke quietly about how similar rail systems had once fed the great factories along the Ruhr River. Another woman nodded with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years studying industrial production charts and transport schedules. They spoke with the calm certainty of experts who believed they understood the structure of modern war. Captain Edward Collins listened without interrupting. He watched the landscape pass with the patience of a man who already knew what waited at the end of the line. After nearly 2 hours the scenery began to change. The wide farmland slowly gave way to thicker clusters of buildings. Brick warehouses appeared beside the rails. Tall chimneys rose into the pale sky. The smell of coal smoke drifted faintly through the small ventilation window above the carriage door. Anna noticed the shift immediately. Industrial districts rarely appeared suddenly. They spread outward in layers, each section feeding the next with materials, labor, and transport. The train slowed as it entered a larger rail junction where multiple tracks converged like a steel web across the ground. Switching engines moved carefully between lines while workers in heavy coats signaled with lanterns and hand flags. Freight cars stood in long organized rows, each one marked with shipment codes and numbered routes. The precision of the arrangement caught Anna's attention. Nothing seemed random. Every movement followed a pattern. One of the German officers near the aisle leaned closer to the window and studied the rail yard with growing curiosity. She recognized something in the organization that felt very deliberate. Not hurried. Not improvised. Planned. Captain Collins finally spoke for the first time since the journey began. His voice was calm and steady. He simply said that they would arrive in a few minutes. No further explanation followed. The train began its final approach into the industrial district. Smoke from dozens of factory stacks drifted across the sky like a slow-moving gray ocean. Large brick buildings stretched for blocks along both sides of the tracks. Conveyor belts crossed between structures. Rail spurs branched off the main line and disappeared through massive loading doors. Workers moved along platforms pushing carts stacked with metal parts and wooden crates. The scale was larger than anything the German officers had expected to see so soon. As the train rolled to a gradual stop beside a wide concrete platform, Anna Weiss remained still for a moment longer than the others. Her eyes moved slowly across the endless rows of factory roofs beyond the station yard. For the first time since leaving the prison camp, her expression lost a trace of its earlier certainty. Somewhere deep in her mind, a quiet calculation had already begun. The platform outside the train was alive with motion the moment the carriage doors opened. Cold air carried the thick scent of coal smoke and hot metal. Workers moved quickly along the concrete platform, pushing heavy carts stacked with machine parts, crates, and long steel cylinders secured with wooden braces. None of them paused to stare at the arriving passengers. The rhythm of the place did not slow for visitors. Captain Edward Collins stepped down first and turned back toward the group of German officers waiting behind him. For a brief moment they remained seated, studying the scene with professional curiosity rather than surprise. They had spent years inside major industrial complexes, and the general atmosphere was not unfamiliar. Factories everywhere carried the same elements: noise, movement, urgency. Yet something here felt different. Anna Weiss rose and carefully stepped onto the platform. The ground vibrated faintly beneath her boots as a freight engine rolled past on a nearby track, pulling a line of loaded railcars. She watched the markings on the sides of the cars as they passed. Each carried coded numbers indicating shipment routes and weight classes. The sequence suggested an organized flow of raw materials moving through the district without interruption. One of the German officers beside her quietly noted the size of the rail yard. The tracks stretched outward in several directions like a wide metal river delta. Switching crews moved constantly, guiding incoming freight cars onto different lines that led directly toward the surrounding factory buildings. Anna followed the direction of one rail spur with her eyes and saw that it disappeared through an enormous steel door built directly into the side of a brick structure that covered nearly an entire city block. Overhead, tall smokestacks released steady streams of gray vapor into the winter sky. None of the smoke appeared chaotic. It rose in thick, controlled columns, evidence that the furnaces inside were operating at stable temperatures. Collins walked ahead and gestured toward a waiting motor vehicle that would carry them the final distance to the production floor. As they drove slowly through the industrial district, the full scale of the operation became clearer. Buildings extended for blocks in every direction. Conveyor bridges crossed above the streets, connecting separate facilities so that materials could move without ever touching the ground. Railroad lines ran between the buildings like veins feeding a massive mechanical heart. Workers in heavy coats moved through wide gates carrying lunch pails and tool cases as shifts changed with quiet efficiency. No one shouted. No one rushed blindly. The system functioned with a calm precision that suggested it had been running this way for a long time. Anna noticed something else that caught her attention even more than the size of the factories. The people themselves looked confident. Their movements were steady, almost routine, as though producing machines for war had become simply another form of daily work. She turned slightly toward Collins and asked how many workers were employed in this district alone. Collins answered in the same calm tone he had used since the journey began. More than 60,000. The number hung quietly in the air of the moving vehicle. None of the German officers responded immediately. Ahead of them, the gates of the first factory slowly opened, revealing a vast interior filled with light, machinery, and a sound that rolled outward like distant thunder. The factory doors opened slowly, and the sound inside rolled outward like a living force. It was not chaos. It was rhythm, a deep mechanical pulse that filled the enormous building from floor to ceiling. Anna Weiss stepped forward with the other officers and crossed the threshold. The air inside was warmer and carried the sharp scent of heated metal and machine oil. Overhead lights stretched in long rows across the ceiling, illuminating a production hall so large that the far wall faded into a haze of motion and sound. The German officers stopped almost immediately, not because they were instructed to, but because their eyes needed a moment to adjust to the scale of what stood before them. Rows of machinery extended across the concrete floor in perfect alignment, each station performing one precise task before the next station continued the process. Steel plates moved slowly along guided tracks. Hydraulic presses lowered with controlled force and then lifted again in steady repetition. Sparks flashed briefly where welding torches sealed joints with careful accuracy. Yet what captured Anna's attention was not the noise or even the size of the machines. It was the flow. Nothing waited. Nothing stalled. Every piece of material moved forward at exactly the right moment, as if the entire building were following a single invisible clock. Captain Collins allowed the group a few seconds to observe before he began walking along a marked pathway that ran safely beside the production lines. The German officers followed. As they moved deeper into the hall, the purpose of the assembly line became clearer. Large metal frames slowly took shape as workers guided parts into position. Wheels were mounted. Suspension systems were secured. Engine housings were lowered into place by overhead cranes that glided along steel rails mounted near the ceiling. One of the German officers leaned slightly toward Anna and quietly counted the stations along the line. She stopped after the 12th stage, realizing there were many more beyond it. Collins spoke calmly over the mechanical hum. He explained that this line alone produced several armored vehicles every hour, depending on the configuration required by the military supply command. Anna did not respond. She was watching something else. At the far end of the hall, completed vehicles rolled forward under their own power before turning onto a ramp that led outside toward a rail loading platform. A fresh line of unfinished frames immediately replaced them on the conveyor. The cycle never paused. Workers moved with calm familiarity, each person performing a single specialized task before stepping back and allowing the next station to continue. It was not hurried. It was disciplined. Anna slowly removed one glove and pressed her fingertips against the metal railing beside the walkway. She could feel the faint vibration of the entire structure through the steel. Thousands of moving parts, hundreds of workers, dozens of machines, all synchronized within one continuous operation. She had studied industrial efficiency for most of her career, yet the quiet precision of this system unsettled her more than the noise ever could. Because what she was seeing was not just a factory. It was a machine designed to produce war with patience, scale, and time on its side. For several minutes the group continued walking along the elevated pathway that overlooked the production floor and a deeper. They moved into the building the more the system revealed its scale. What had first appeared to be a single assembly line slowly unfolded into a network of parallel lines stretching across the hall like organized rivers of steel. Each line carried a slightly different configuration, yet every movement remained synchronized. Overhead cranes glided back and forth along rails suspended nearly 30 feet above the floor, lifting heavy engine blocks and lowering them with careful precision onto waiting frames. The cranes moved so smoothly that their operators barely seemed to exert effort, guiding massive components as calmly as if they were arranging tools on a workbench. Anna Weiss slowed her pace as she studied the timing between each station. Her mind automatically began calculating intervals. A steel frame moved forward. Exactly 20 seconds later, a suspension unit arrived from a side conveyor. 10 seconds after that, a worker guided a drive shaft into position while another technician tightened bolts using a pneumatic wrench that delivered identical torque every time. The pattern repeated without hesitation. She noticed something that unsettled her even more than the machinery. No one appeared rushed. The workers did not look like people straining to keep up with production. Instead, they moved with quiet familiarity, performing their tasks with the confidence of repetition. A middle-aged machinist wiped his hands on a cloth and checked a gauge before signaling for the next frame to advance. A young woman guided a measuring tool along a welded seam and nodded with satisfaction before stepping aside. The entire hall functioned like a carefully rehearsed orchestra where every participant already knew the rhythm. One of the German officers quietly asked Collins how long this facility had been operating. Collins replied that construction had begun several years earlier when the government anticipated the need for large-scale production. The answer lingered in the air for a moment. Anticipation. Planning. Time invested before the full pressure of war had arrived. Anna looked toward the far side of the building where another row of doors opened to reveal additional workshops beyond the main hall. Through those openings, she could see more machinery, more conveyors, more workers continuing the same disciplined flow of production. She realized that what they were seeing might represent only a fraction of the total operation. A supervisor approached Collins and handed him a clipboard containing several pages of production reports. Collins glanced at the numbers briefly before returning the clipboard. Anna caught only a short glimpse of the figures, but it was enough to understand their meaning. Daily output. Weekly quotas. Shipment schedules coordinated with rail departures that would carry finished machines across the country to ports and supply depots. She placed her glove back onto her hand slowly, as if the simple action helped organize her thoughts. The confidence she had carried since leaving the prison camp had not vanished, but it had begun to shift into something quieter. Because every minute they remained inside this building revealed another layer of preparation, another level of scale, and another reminder that the war beyond these walls was being supported by an industrial engine that did not appear to tire. The deeper the group moved through the production complex, the more the sound of industry surrounded them until it felt almost like standing inside a living engine. The steady rhythm of presses, the controlled hum of conveyor motors, and the distant echo of metal meeting metal blended into a continuous mechanical heartbeat that never seemed to slow. Anna Weiss kept her eyes moving, studying each section of the operation with the attention of someone who had spent years inside similar facilities. Yet what she saw here did not match the pattern she expected. In most factories she had known, even the best organized ones, small interruptions always appeared. A shipment would arrive late. A machine would pause for adjustment. Workers would gather briefly to solve a problem before the line could continue. Here she saw almost none of that. The flow remained constant. Each station fed the next with such careful timing that the system appeared almost effortless. Captain Edward Collins guided the group along another walkway that overlooked a separate section of the hall where engines were assembled. Massive steel blocks arrived from a side rail line and were lifted by cranes before being lowered onto work platforms surrounded by technicians. The workers moved with quiet confidence, checking measurements, securing components, and sending each finished engine forward toward the next stage without hesitation. Anna noticed something that made her slow her pace again. A large board mounted high on the wall displayed production numbers written in clear white chalk. Columns of figures tracked hourly output, daily targets, and weekly totals. The numbers were not small. One of the German officers quietly read them under her breath, then stopped speaking altogether. The scale suggested that this facility alone produced more engines in a single week than many European plants could manage in an entire month. Collins did not draw attention to the board. He simply continued walking as if the figures were ordinary information. Yet Anna could feel the effect spreading through the group behind her. The confident tone that had filled their earlier conversation during the train journey had faded into thoughtful silence. They were no longer discussing theories about industrial capacity. They were witnessing it in motion. As they reached another observation platform, the view opened toward an enormous loading area where completed vehicles rolled slowly toward a line of waiting railcars outside the building. Workers secured each machine onto flatbed wagons while clerks recorded serial numbers and shipment destinations. Within minutes, the rail cars were sealed and added to a departing train that would carry them toward ports along the western coast. Anna followed the movement with careful attention. Production was only one part of the system. Distribution completed the equation. If the flow from factory floor to rail line remained uninterrupted, the machines produced here could reach distant battlefields with remarkable speed. She rested her hand lightly against the metal railing and watched another finished vehicle move forward under its own power. For the first time since entering the building, she spoke quietly enough that only the officer beside her could hear. She said that the real strength of this place was not simply the machines or the workers. It was the patience of a nation that had prepared its industry to continue like this day after day, week after week, until the outcome of the war was decided by endurance rather than sudden victory. They left the first production hall through a wide corridor that connected the building to another section of the complex, and for a moment the sound of machinery softened into a distant echo behind thick brick walls. The quiet lasted only a few seconds before a new sound slowly replaced it, deeper and heavier, like a rolling thunder that vibrated through the concrete floor beneath their boots. Anna Weiss felt it before she fully heard it. The faint trembling beneath the walkway told her that whatever waited ahead operated on an even larger scale. Captain Edward Collins pushed open a heavy steel door, and the group stepped into another massive chamber that stretched so far across the factory grounds that the far end disappeared into a haze of light and movement. Here the work was different. Instead of long assembly lines, enormous presses dominated the floor. Each machine stood several stories tall, built from thick steel frames anchored deep into the foundation. When one of the presses came down, the sound traveled across the hall like a slow explosion contained inside metal walls. Sheets of raw steel moved forward along rollers toward the machines where technicians guided them carefully into position. With measured force, the presses lowered and reshaped the flat metal into curved armor plates designed to fit specific vehicle frames. Anna stopped walking and watched the process with growing focus. She had seen industrial presses before, but rarely on this scale and never arranged in such numbers. One press formed the plates. Another trimmed them to precise dimensions. A third machine drilled mounting points with mechanical arms that moved with exact timing. Every plate then moved onward toward the welding stations where teams of specialists sealed the sections into reinforced structures. Nearby, rail carts carried stacks of newly shaped components toward another hall where they would become part of the vehicles already rolling through the assembly lines. One of the German officers quietly counted the presses as her eyes moved across the building. She stopped counting when she reached 20 and realized there were still more hidden behind the rows of steel supports. Collins spoke again in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of the tour. He explained that the facility had expanded several times during the war as production demands increased. The presses operated around the clock in rotating shifts so that the steel never stopped moving. Anna looked upward toward a high observation window where a large clock hung above the factory floor. The hands moved slowly across the face, yet the activity below never seemed to pause even for a moment. Workers rotated in and out while the machines continued their steady rhythm. It was a system designed not for short bursts of effort, but for endless repetition. She realized that the true power of this place was not hidden in a single machine or a single line of workers. It was the continuity. Hour after hour, the presses would continue shaping steel. Hour after hour, the assembly lines would continue transforming parts into finished vehicles. And hour after hour, the rail lines outside would continue carrying those machines across oceans and continents. For the first time since entering the complex, Anna felt a quiet weight settle into her thoughts, because every calculation she had once trusted was beginning to shift under the pressure of what she was witnessing. For a long moment, the group remained standing inside the hall of presses while the machines continued their steady work around them. The sound no longer felt shocking. Instead, it settled into a constant presence, like standing beside a powerful river that never stopped flowing. Anna Weiss slowly walked toward the observation rail that overlooked the loading section of the steel operation. From there, she could see the entire path the armor plates followed after leaving the presses. Freshly shaped steel moved along heavy rollers toward measuring stations where technicians checked each curve with metal gauges designed for exact tolerances. Nothing appeared rushed. Each plate paused only long enough for inspection before moving forward again toward a line of welding frames where teams secured reinforcement ribs along the inner surfaces. Beyond that point, the finished armor sections disappeared through another wide doorway that connected directly to the vehicle assembly halls they had visited earlier. Anna watched the process carefully and began tracing the timing in her mind. Steel arrived by rail from distant mills. Within hours, it entered the presses. Within another set of hours, it moved through shaping, reinforcement, and inspection. By the end of the same day, those plates were already becoming part of completed machines leaving the factory grounds. The efficiency was not hidden. It was visible in every step. One of the German officers beside her spoke quietly, almost to herself, calculating how many vehicles this complex might produce in a single month if the pace remained constant. Her estimate stopped halfway through the sentence because the number seemed too large to say comfortably. Captain Edward Collins rested his hands lightly on the railing beside them and allowed the silence to settle. Then he explained something that none of the visitors had yet considered. This factory was only one facility among many operating across the country. Similar production centers existed in other regions, each responsible for a different part of the broader supply network. Some produced engines. Others focused on aircraft, structures, or naval components. All of them were linked by rail, shipping ports, and centralized planning offices that coordinated material flow across thousands of miles. Anna did not look away from the factory floor as she absorbed the information. The idea of a single powerful factory was familiar to her. Germany had many such facilities. But the scale of a distributed network working with the same discipline was something else entirely. She imagined dozens of these halls operating simultaneously, each one sending finished machines outward like steady waves moving across a vast ocean. Another freight train slowly rolled past the loading yard outside the hall windows, its flatbed cars already carrying freshly completed vehicles secured beneath protective covers. Workers moved quickly along the platform, making final checks before the train continued its journey toward the western ports. Anna followed the departing train with her eyes until it disappeared behind the outer buildings of the complex. For the first time that day, she understood that what they were seeing was not simply industrial power. It was time itself being transformed into machinery, day after day, hour after hour, until the balance of the war quietly shifted in favor of the nation that could keep its factories moving the longest. The tour continued beyond the Hall of Presses, moving through another wide corridor where tall windows allowed pale winter light to spill across the polished concrete floor. For the first time since entering the complex, the mechanical thunder softened enough that the group could hear their own footsteps. Yet even here the faint vibration of distant machines traveled through the walls, a reminder that the enormous system surrounding them never truly stopped working. Anna Weiss walked near the front of the group beside Captain Edward Collins, her expression thoughtful but composed. She had spent most of the visit calculating silently, measuring what she had seen against the industrial reports she once studied in Germany. Every observation pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The scale of the operation extended far beyond a single impressive facility. It was part of something larger that had been prepared with patience long before the war reached its most intense years. Collins opened another heavy door that led onto a high observation balcony overlooking the exterior loading yards. Cold air drifted inside immediately, carrying the distant whistle of a departing locomotive. From this height, the entire district unfolded. Beneath them, rail lines curved through the complex like wide steel highways. Long freight trains waited on multiple tracks while cranes lifted cargo from factory platforms onto the rail cars below. Workers moved along the platforms securing shipments while clerks recorded numbers on long ledgers that tracked every departure. Anna rested her gloved hands on the railing and studied the scene with careful attention. Each train carried dozens of machines. Each machine represented weeks of coordinated work that had begun with raw materials arriving from distant mines and mills. Yet the system here moved those materials forward without hesitation, transforming them into finished equipment that disappeared along the rail lines almost as quickly as it had been created. One of the German officers quietly asked Collins how many trains left the district each day. Collins answered without drama. The number varied depending on supply schedules, but departures often continued from early morning until well after sunset. Anna imagined the routes those trains followed once they left the city. Some would travel west toward shipping ports where vessels waited to carry cargo across the Atlantic Ocean. Others would move south toward training depots and military bases where newly built machines entered service almost immediately. She realized that the factory floor they had walked through earlier represented only the beginning of a much longer chain. Production alone did not decide the outcome of a war. The ability to move those machines across continents, oceans, and supply networks determined whether that production truly mattered. Behind them, another train slowly began to move, its long line of freight cars sliding forward with steady momentum. The sound of the engine echoed across the industrial district as it carried another shipment away from the factory gates. Anna followed the departing train until it vanished behind a row of warehouses near the edge of the yard. For the first time since arriving that morning, she spoke softly enough that only Collins could hear her. She said that what they had witnessed was not simply a factory system. It was a country that had learned how to turn time, discipline, and patience into an industrial force capable of continuing long after others had exhausted their strength. The wind on the observation balcony carried the distant sound of factory whistles signaling the shift change across the industrial district. Workers began moving along the rail platforms below, some finishing their duties, while others arrived to replace them. And yet the machines inside the buildings never slowed. Anna Weiss noticed this immediately. The people rotated, but the system remained constant. It was designed to continue without interruption. Captain Edward Collins allowed the group to remain on the balcony for several quiet minutes before he finally gestured toward the staircase that would lead them back down to the main yard. No one argued. The German officers followed slowly, each one carrying her own private thoughts after what they had seen. When they stepped outside the factory gates, the cold afternoon air felt sharper than before. The sky had shifted into a pale winter blue and long shadows stretched across the rail yard as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Another freight train was already being prepared on a nearby track, its flatbed cars lined with fresh equipment waiting to be secured. Workers tightened chains and checked cargo lists while a locomotive idled patiently at the front of the line. Anna paused for a moment near the edge of the yard and watched the preparation with careful attention. The efficiency had not ended inside the buildings. The same discipline extended outward into every step of transport and delivery. She imagined the countless reports that must travel through British command offices each day, tracking every shipment leaving facilities like this one. Captain Collins stood beside her, hands resting calmly inside the pockets of his coat. For most of the day, he had offered only brief explanations, allowing the machines and numbers to speak for themselves. Now, as the group prepared to leave the complex, one of the German officers finally broke the long silence that had settled over them. She asked Collins a simple question. "How many places like this exist across your country?" Collins did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the long rows of factories stretching toward the distant skyline, where dozens of smokestacks released their steady columns into the cold sky. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm and almost casual. He said there were many facilities, each responsible for a different part of the larger system. Some built aircraft structures, some produced engines, others focused on naval equipment or transport vehicles. Together they formed a network that had been expanding year after year. The officer who asked the question did not respond. Anna continued watching the train crews secure the final chains across the cargo. The locomotive released a low whistle and the long line of rail cars began to move slowly forward, carrying another shipment away from the complex. The sound faded gradually as the train disappeared down the tracks leading toward the western ports. Anna lowered her gaze to the steel rails beneath her feet and quietly calculated the distance that shipment would travel before reaching its destination. When she finally looked back toward the factory buildings, the confidence she had carried earlier that morning had changed into something far more thoughtful. Because she now understood that what they had witnessed during the day was only a small window into a much larger machine that was still moving, still producing, and still preparing for tomorrow. The return journey began in the late afternoon when the pale winter light was already fading behind the tall factory chimneys. A military vehicle carried the group back through the industrial district toward the rail station where their train waited. This time the road felt quieter. Earlier that morning, the German officers had studied the factories with the curiosity of professionals evaluating a rival system. Now their attention moved differently. They watched the buildings pass in silence as the vehicle rolled through streets lined with warehouses, rail sidings, and endless rows of brick production halls. Smoke still rose steadily from the chimneys. Conveyor bridges still moved materials from building to building. Nothing had slowed simply because a small group of visitors had arrived and departed. Anna Weiss sat near the rear of the vehicle, her eyes following the long lines of rail track that ran beside the road. She counted freight cars without meaning to, noticing the markings that indicated destinations and cargo classifications. Even the codes painted along the sides of the cars reflected careful planning. Some shipments would travel west toward the coast. Others would move inland toward training grounds and supply depots. Each route formed part of the same steady system she had been studying since the morning. When they reached the station platform, the train was already waiting, steam drifting slowly upward into the cold air. The guards opened the carriage door, and the group climbed inside without conversation. A few railway workers walked along the platform checking the couplings between the cars, while a conductor studied a clipboard beneath the fading light. Captain Edward Collins remained outside for a moment, speaking quietly with the conductor before finally stepping aboard as well. The door closed, and the train began to move within minutes. As the wheels found their rhythm along the tracks, the industrial district gradually disappeared behind them. The smokestacks faded into the distance until only the open winter countryside remained beyond the windows. For a long time no one spoke inside the carriage. The earlier confidence that had filled their voices during the journey north had dissolved somewhere inside the factory halls they had just left behind. Anna watched the field slide past the glass, but her thoughts remained inside the production complex. She replayed the numbers she had seen on the factory boards, the steady movement of steel through the presses, the assembly lines that never paused, the trains carrying finished machines away hour after hour. Eventually, one of the officers seated across from her broke the silence. She spoke quietly, almost carefully, as if testing the weight of her own words. She said that if production continued at that pace across multiple facilities, the output would grow larger with every passing month. No one argued with the observation. Anna rested her hands together and looked down for a moment before answering. Her voice was calm, but the certainty inside it had changed. She said that what they had witnessed was not simply a display designed for visitors. It was a system built to continue far beyond the length of a single campaign. The train continued south through the darkening countryside, carrying them back toward the prisoner camp where the day had begun. Outside the windows, the last light of the afternoon slowly faded, and inside the carriage the silence returned once again as each woman quietly considered what the future of the war might look like if the machines they had seen never stopped. The train reached the small station near the prisoner camp long after sunset. A thin layer of frost had already formed along the wooden platform, and the cold air carried the distant sound of wind moving through the empty fields beyond the rail line. When the carriage door opened, the guards stepped down first, lanterns casting soft circles of light across the ground. One by one, the German officers followed, their boots touching the platform with the same quiet composure they had shown when the journey began that morning. Yet something had changed during the long day. Earlier, their eyes had studied the surroundings with curiosity and confidence, as if the world beyond the prison fences was simply another system to evaluate. Now their movements were slower, more thoughtful. Captain Edward Collins walked beside them as they crossed the platform toward the waiting transport truck that would return them to the camp. He did not speak. There was no need to explain what they had seen. The factories, the rail yards, and the endless movement of machinery had already delivered their own message more clearly than any speech could have done. The truck carried them back along the narrow country road through the dark countryside. The fields were quiet beneath the winter sky, and the only sound was the steady engine moving through the cold night air. Anna Weiss sat near the rear of the truck, her gaze resting on the horizon where the faint glow of distant industrial cities still colored the clouds far away. Somewhere beyond those hills, the factories continued their work. The presses would still be shaping steel. The assembly lines would still be moving forward one station at a time. Trains would still be leaving the yards carrying machines toward ports and supply depots across the world. The system they had witnessed did not depend on a single day or a single visitor. It would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that again. When the truck finally passed through the gates of the camp, the guards guided the prisoners back toward the familiar wooden buildings where they slept. The yard looked the same as it had that morning, quiet and controlled beneath the watchtowers. Yet for Anna, the place felt different now, because her mind carried images that could not easily be forgotten. Before entering the building, she paused for a brief moment and looked back toward the dark road beyond the camp fence. One of the officers standing beside her spoke softly, asking whether the visit had answered the question they brought with them. Anna considered the thought carefully before she replied. Her voice remained calm, but it carried a new weight of understanding. She said that the factories had not simply shown the strength of a nation. They had shown something far more powerful. They had shown patience. Because wars are not always decided by a single battle or a single moment of victory. Sometimes they are decided quietly, hour after hour, inside buildings where machines continue working long after pride and certainty have already begun to fade.